Can you think of a problem a church has that discipleship won't fix? I have yet to come up with one. Lack of finances, discipleship will fix that. Lack of volunteers, bad theology, lack of evangelism. You can't name a significant problem that discipleship won't fix. The only thing discipleship will not promise to fix is the size of your church.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we could make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. If you want to support the work we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you're new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included Lance Ford, Nakme Panahi, and Alan Hirsch. You go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Karl Vaters. Karl Vaters is the author of 5 books, including the brand new De-Sizing the Church. Karl produces resources for helping small churches thrive at karlvaters.com. His heart is to help pastors of small churches, up to 90% of us, find the resources to lead well and to capitalize on the unique advantages that come with pastoring a small church, something virtually every pastor will spend at least some of their ministry years doing. He also believes that big and small churches can and should work together more often, to the benefit and blessing of everyone. Karl also hosts a bi-weekly podcast, The Church Lobby. Episodes feature in-depth interviews and the topics that concern pastors, especially those who minister in a small church context. Karl has served in a small church ministry for over 40 years, so he speaks and writes from decades of hands-on pastoral experience. This conversation with Karl Vaters is a fascinating look at the history and impact of the church growth movement in America and around the world. Karl shares how the movement started with good intentions to reach more people for Christ, but over time it became an unhealthy obsession with numerical growth in bigger churches. The danger is that we've often confused numerical size with spiritual health. Karl challenges us to shift our focus away from just growing the numbers and instead prioritize discipleship and integrity in our churches. He believes discipleship can fix most problems the church faces because it's about developing mature followers of Jesus, not just filling seats. Additionally, Karl warns against the celebrity culture that has crept into the church, where we elevate certain pastors and put them on a pedestal. Instead, he advocates for a return to a more collaborative, team-based leadership that equips the whole body for ministry. Overall, this was a thought-provoking conversation that calls the church back to its biblical foundations of making disciples, walking in integrity, and letting Jesus build his church. Join us as we de-size the church. Here's my conversation with Karl Vaters. Well, Karl, welcome to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about your book, De-Sizing the Church, what the church growth movement has done for us, how we have co-opted some of that in the American stream and the American church, and then what does it look like going from here so that we could have healthy churches and healthy disciples and what that looks like. But first, I'd love to hear a little of your story of where you're coming from. What are you doing in ministry? What does it look like for you day in and day out?
Yeah, I've been in pastoral ministry for over 40 years now. And for the first 25 or so, well, actually, but going back before that, when I was in Bible college, I didn't hear anything about church growth. It was late 70s, early 80s. Church growth was kind of in the wind, but it was really it was just in its beginning stages. And I didn't have a class on church growth. I don't think I ever heard the phrase church growth. I even had an internship where somebody gave me Robert Schuller's book, Your Church Has Real Possibilities, which is considered one of the first church growth books, at least in one of the ways of church growth, which we'll get into in a minute. But I never really heard church growth. It wasn't, I was in one of the last classes that was trained in kind of the old school way of doing pastoring, which wasn't about getting the numbers up. It was about ministering to the people you have and being and impacting your community. And then about 5 years after I was out, so mid-1980s or so, all of that started to shift and everything became about church growth. The church growth movement came in really hard and heavy. I saw it. I appreciated a lot of what they were trying to do. And I thought, I've got to do some unlearning and relearning. So I really shifted into the church growth movement and mode. And long story short, it didn't work for me. There were some good things about it that I really appreciated, their missional emphasis and so on. But the numbers just didn't go up like the church growth movement seemed to promise. And I was left kind of reeling. So about 15 to 20 years ago, I went through about a 5-year crisis really of ministry, wondering, okay, am I just, messing up here? Because one of the big phrases, of course, was all healthy things grow, which means the alternative must be, well, if you're not growing, you must not be healthy, which in fact was how it was interpreted. Like if your numbers aren't up, that's the sign of a problem, and we got to figure out what the problem is. And I literally brought in experts to our church, like, sit in this, give me an assessment of what's happening. At every one of them, I mean, people from outside the country. I remember we had an Irish guy in once. He went, well, even an Irishman can figure out this thing isn't going to stay small for long. Like that was his literal phrase. I was like, but it stayed small. Like we're doing everything everybody tells us to do, and it's not. And I'm not living in a tiny town with nobody around. I live in Orange County, California. I live less than 2 miles from the original Calvary Chapel, Crystal Cathedral, Church on the Way, Angelus Temple, Saddleback. I mean, all of these massive churches, and it just didn't go up for us. So I started questioning my call to ministry, quite frankly, at that point. And I had some friends who really helped me walk through that to understand I was called to ministry, and that did not mean that my numbers were going to constantly go up. And then when I started looking around, I realizing, hey, I'm not the only one who's in this place of confusion over this. And so there must be something else going on. So I started looking around, seeing all these healthy small churches that weren't getting bigger and asking what's going on here. And from that started writing and started speaking about what is good about the small church and what is strategic about the small church, that small isn't a fix, but I believe small is a part of the strategy that God is using. And so that's where I am today. I spend my time with small churches, encouraging them, resourcing them, and now pushing back a bit against some of the downsides of the church growth movement that it's now been around long enough for us to see. I think there's a lot of great about the church growth movement, but we've had 40 years of it, and that's enough for us to also see some of the unintended negative consequences.
You're part of this. This is your journey. This is what you have started to discover as you were part of the church growth movement, been influenced by a lot of the culture of church growth and what that looks like. And it's saying numbers are our metric. Numbers are our key. And if it's healthy, it's going to grow. And working a little bit with small churches now, I think it's important for people to know that there is some health that could be had in a small church, and small church settings are not bad because they're not growing numerically. Yeah. So can you help us, give us a little history of the church growth movement? Take us back to Donald McGavran. What was he discovering, and the things that he was pulling out to say what was working overseas? All Nations Kansas City has 2 exciting events with Jamie and Donna Winship coming up. Join us on September 13th for our annual fundraiser, Further Together, with Jamie and Donna as our main speakers. Did you know that God is on the move all around the world? You will hear stories about people receiving their true identity from God and impacting nations. And you will be invited to join us so that more stories like these can happen and we can see peace in the midst of conflict. The following day, September 14th, Jamie and Donna will be doing their identity exchange workshop. Join us to discover your true identity and experience a life of joy, peace, and freedom. You can register for both events at allnations.us.
Yeah, this was really the genesis of the book, Resizing the Church. About 3 or 4 years ago, my first 4 books were about encouraging and resourcing small church pastors. And in some ways, I feel like the guy who's pulling the bodies out of the river. A lot of pastors like me who are about to quit ministry because they can't get the numbers up. And I'm like, it's okay, you can be strategic and small. And I started thinking, okay, but who's throwing the bodies in the river upstream? So I thought, let's do a history of the church growth movement because we're obsessed with bigness. And that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from somewhere. And so I thought, I want to find out where it came from. And so I did some research into the church growth movement. And it starts with, as you mentioned, a man named Donald McGavran. And Donald McGavran was a missionary in India in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And he started noticing that there were entire villages that were coming to Christ. And he thought, wow, this is really something. So he thought, I'm going to go to these villages. I'm going to study what's happening here and see if God is doing something here that we can learn from, that we can then help others with in reaching people for Jesus. And he did that study. And then when he retired, he traveled through Africa for a bit where similar things were happening. And he came home and he wrote his first book called The Bridges of God in the early 1960s. And that book is by far maybe the most impactful. Well, it is the most impactful book of the church growth movement. It's literally the book in which the term church growth originally appeared in print, for instance. And almost nobody knows McGavran's name today, and even fewer have read his book, The Bridges of God. But it's an absolute landmark book that changed the way we started thinking about approaching church. No longer just simply, well, these are the people I've got and I'll take care of them. But what is God doing and how can we start reaching more people? He then, in the early 1970s, late 1960s actually, started the Fuller Church Growth Institute here in Pasadena, near where I live here in California. And for the first 7 years, he would not allow American pastors to take his classes on church growth. Now you can't just say no American pastors allowed. You get in trouble for that. So what he did was he set up some requirements for every student, like you had to be a mid-career missionary, you had to master a second language, you had to actually write a paper in advance that showed that you had an expertise in an indigenous people group outside of your own, which those three, that takes 99.9% of American pastors out, including me. And so he's teaching, foreign pastors mostly, but American pastors are reading his book and are wanting more information and are hearing this class is great. So after 7 years, he finally relents, and in the early 1970s, he and one of his early students, C. Peter Wagner, teach the first church growth class at Fuller Institute that included American pastors. And that is universally understood to be the spark point for the American church growth movement. Everything that we experienced since then comes from that. So I read through that and I'm wondering, okay, what was it? Why did he exclude American pastors? What was going on? So I actually got a hold of his biographer, Gary McIntosh. And Dr. McIntosh is one of the experts on the church growth movement and wrote the biography of Donald McGavran. And he said the reason that Donald McGavran didn't want American pastors in is because he knew that the way we approach growth in America is very different than most of the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, and his book was about how do we increase Christians as a percentage of the population. That means one big church, do that. If that means a whole bunch of little churches, let's do that. If that means a combination of the two, let's do that. Let's just find the best way to reach the most people for Jesus. But he thought, if we give this to American pastors will turn this into a big church contest, which is exactly what we did. It's exactly what we did. So for years, I blamed Donald McGavran for this obsession with size. But in researching it, I found out he saw the problems with that as well, and that's not what he was going for. So what he did was he kind of gave cover, and he gave language to church growth. He gave ideas for church growth, and he kind of gave cover to those who are obsessed with having a big church and say, well, this is what the principles say. And in fact, that wasn't what they say. His principles were, how do we increase Christians as a percentage of the population, not how do individual churches get bigger?
it's focused on new people coming to Christ and evangelism, and then gathering into churches to see more people come to Jesus. So then after this class with C. Peter Wagner and the American pastors, what shifted and what changed? It seems like it went from a descriptive thing of what was happening around the world to prescriptive. This is how you do it, and everybody's going to take the blueprint and run with it.
Yeah. There's the American stream and there's the McGavran stream. And the McGavran stream is really, okay, here's what God is doing in other places. Let's learn from that, like you said. And the American stream is more, okay, here's how my church got big. Now you do the same thing I did. And so any American pastors who have spent any time going to several conferences, we've seen this, right? Where the main speaker is touted, and the first line in the main speaker's biography is how big their church is and how quickly it got there. We went from 30 to 3,000 in 3 years. It's not just enough to go from 30 to 3,000. You have to get there fast, right? And we've become obsessed with this, but that's not how the kingdom of God has ever worked, where we just follow what God is doing over here and he's going to do it exactly the same way over there. I mean, that Jesus didn't even perform miracles the same way twice. Like every single miracle was performed with a different modus operandi. And I believe that's in purpose so that we'd understand it's not about magic words or particular actions. It's about the faith that's behind it. And God does the same thing as Jesus is building his church. He does it in the same way. There are underlying biblical principles that we can learn, but there are very, very few actions that can be repeated, that can be done in one church and repeated for the same impact in another. And yet we continue to obsess over, give me a church growth hack, please. And there are no hacks. There are principles. McGavran was about the principles.
What else happened in the American stream of the church growth movement? What are some of the things that the American church has co-opted so that we can be bigger and fatter and, more size?
Yeah, well, the idea of bigger is better as a not a universally American thing, but a specifically American thing. We really like big stuff. It actually goes back to our founding. When you go to the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion, right? So the founders go, we don't want a state church. Good idea. We don't want a state church. But when you have a state church, like in Europe at the time, and in a couple of European countries still today, when you have a state church, when the state collects taxes, they also collect tithes, and then they distribute those tithes to the churches. So in the churches they came out of in Europe, those state-sponsored churches didn't need to have a strong tithing base because the tithe was collected by law from the government and then doled out to the churches. But when you come to America, if there's no state church, then they don't collect tithes through the state to give to you. And so the bigger crowd you can draw and the more money you can get out of them, the more successful the church appears to be. So this size obsession in the church is one of the unintended negative consequences of some of America's best ideas. And I mean, best ideas like, freedom of religion is freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. These are our best ideas. But even great ideas like that have unintended negative consequences. And that's some of it. So how it played itself out in America then, and especially as America expanded westward, and we did some wonderful things, but also made some horrific mistakes in the ways we treated, minorities and whole manifest destiny and all of that. So we confused some really bad ideas with some really good ideas. And we ended up with this really strange hybrid today where we really do have this obsession with size, and then we transfer it to other places as well. So almost anywhere you go in the world today where there is an obsession with size, they can trace that obsession back to American missionaries or more recently, American church growth proponents going to these countries to teach church growth principles. So almost the entire obsession with size internationally comes from American soil. And again, is an unintended consequence of what are absolutely some of the best things that America has done.
So you're calling for a desizing of the church. Since that's not a real word, what do you mean by desizing? What does that look like for you? What is desizing? Is it what is it? It's
What do
not
you?
just about
Yeah.
numbers. So
No,
what
it's
is
not.
desizing?
It's not. What do you mean it's not a real word? It's on the cover of my book.
It is
I,
now.
I
It
did
is
well.
now that you wrote it.
I made a word. Yeah, I guess we can do that when we want to. Yeah, I did. I actually created the word that did not exist because I wanted a very simple way of phrasing it. So desizing, first of all, is not downsizing. I don't think small churches are better than big churches. I'm a small church proponent because that's where I've done all my ministry time. And and because that's where the greatest need is right now. There aren't enough resources for small churches. So I am pro small church, but I'm not anti big church. I don't think small churches are better than big. So it's not downsizing, and it's not even right sizing because I don't think there's any right size for a church. I think, again, small churches need to be all over the place for all kinds of different reasons. But desizing is about uncoupling the idea of successful ministry from numerical increase. For 40 years, we've had, and I do this in the book, I've got a continuum. So a one-dimensional continuum, a line. And on one side of the line, you've got small churches, and those are presumed to be unhealthy. And on the other end of the line, you've got big churches, and those are presumed to be healthy. And almost every church growth conference you're going to go to makes that presumption and says, okay, all of you people on the left side of the line, you're small, you must be unhealthy. Come and listen to these churches that are big, they must be healthy, and hear how they got big. And we're going to presume that health was the reason that they got big. And it's a one-dimensional continuum. And so that's what we've had for about 40 years. And that is a literally physically one-dimensionally narrow view of church health and growth. If we break it out into two dimensions, so imagine now an x-axis and a y-axis, up and down and sideways. Now you've got four different boxes. Bottom left, you've got small and unhealthy. That's still there. Top right, you've got big and healthy. That's still there. But you've also got small and healthy churches, and you've got big and unhealthy churches. And when you break it out two-dimensionally rather than just one-dimensionally, we start understanding, okay, the information and the wisdom shouldn't just flow from big to small. The information and wisdom should always flow from healthy to unhealthy, whatever the size may be. Now, unhealthy small churches are more likely to learn more from healthy small churches because there's similarities of style and methods when you're small. And unhealthy large churches will probably learn more from healthy large churches for the same reasons. But there are times when, yes, unhealthy small churches can learn from healthy big churches. And here's the whole weird new thing I'm going to throw into the mix that almost nobody considers. Unhealthy big churches can actually learn from healthy small churches too. The wisdom doesn't just flow downhill from big to small.
So then, if we can start to learn from what healthy is, first, can you help us to figure out what is healthy? Let's start there. What is a healthy church?
Yeah. Actually, in the book, in the appendix, there's a survey that everybody can take. It's 16 statements that are non-numerically based statements about church health. So I'm going to grab my book because I can't remember what I wrote unless I go into it and read it. And they are non-numerical. So let me find it. Where's the appendix here? There we go. Okay. So there are 4 different categories, and the 4 categories are theology, leadership, mission, and attitude. And under each one of them, there are 4 different statements that you assess your church by. Yes, we do this awesomely, or no, we do this terribly. As for instance, under theology, the issue of the Bible. The eternal truths of the Bible are taught well and applied to our lives in practical ways. Yes, we do that awesomely. Give yourself a 5. No, we do that terribly. Give yourself a 0. Under mission, for instance, under outreach, congregation members feel good about telling their friends about the church and inviting them to attend. Yes, we do that awesomely. Or no, we do that terribly. And if you go through that, 16 different statements, all non-numerical. They're about mission, attitude, leadership, and theology. And you can get a readout that says, hey, it turns out we're maybe healthier than we thought, even though we aren't bigger. Or on the converse, hey, we aren't as healthy as we thought. We've just been counting the numbers, and it turns out we're doing leadership okay, but we're not doing theology very well, or whatever. So these are all just kind of health markers that come from Scripture, and come from our attitude towards Scripture. So it's about worship, it's about evangelism, it's about fellowship, it's about ministry, and all of these different things. But we've become so obsessed with chasing numerical markers that we're often not paying attention to the non-numerical markers that are usually a better sign of whether or not a church is healthy.
So then just take me into a denominational meeting of church pastors and pastors together, or a conference or something. If I come up to you, Karl, we meet at a conference, instead of saying, tell me about so when I say, yeah, tell me about your church, most people lead with size, right?
Yeah.
Numbers, size.
Yeah.
How do we shift that? What are the things that you can say in those meetings so that our first and primary thing isn't numerical, but it is about health?
Yeah. We need fewer stats and more stories. That's the quick one, the quick answer. So let me break that down. We've all faced that. Anybody who's been in pastoral ministry any length of time will know what it's like. And if you're not running real strong, you kind of dread going because the question's going to come up, and you're going to, and most of us fudge the numbers. We do. Let's be honest about it. So here's what I suggest for everybody, but especially for the small church pastor who may be feeling discouraged by the numbers. Go to these conferences, and before you go, sit down and take a look at your church and ask yourself, okay, what are some life transformation stories that the Lord has been doing in the last 6 months to a year here in the church? And have them preloaded and ready to go. Because you're not going to be able to think of them at the moment. The numbers, how many people were there last Sunday, you can recall that fairly accurately, fairly quickly, because you can see it physically in front of you. But, the life transformation stories sometimes kind of drift into the back. In fact, I encourage pastors to do what I call a healthy church logbook. And I've actually got a PDF online for that people can go and find on my website. And it gives you a guidance for how to do that. And so that you're keeping track of the stories that happen, so that when you forget or when your numbers are down and you think, are we even doing any impact? Go through the Healthy Church logbook and go, oh yeah, that person had this thing, and this marriage got reconciled, and this prodigal child came back home again and back into the faith, and so on, so that you've got stories. So have these stories ready to go. And then when people come to you and go, so how's your church running? You can say, let me tell you about so-and-so. Let me tell you about this story about this family. Here's a family that didn't know Jesus at all. And somebody in our church who was so excited about what we were doing just befriended them at a backyard barbecue recently. And they were asking them, so what'd you do this weekend? And when they said they went to church, they thought, really, I hate church. I would never go. But finally, after a few weeks, they trusted them enough to come to church with them. And they were blown away because this church isn't anything like they expected it to be. They didn't have the judgmentalism they were expecting. There was a joy in the place that they weren't expecting. There was an acceptance and a love that reached out to them. And they very, very soon realized, hey, they feel God's call upon their heart, and their lives are being transformed and their family is coming back together again. That's what this is supposed to be about anyway. That's way better than we ran 250 last week, or we're down to 75 last week, or we're up to 75 last week. The stories are way better than stats, but we have to proactively pursue them, record them, and remember them.
Yeah. I agree. That's so important. Stories are much more impactful as well. It tells me a lot more about who you are, what you do, what your church is like, the impact that you're having than just a number can do. Yeah. So, if you're say that we have actually we've co-opted some of these church growth paradigms and started to say, this is the blueprint to be able to grow your church. We're growing some things. And so there are some unhealthy big churches. What are some course corrections that we can do as the church to move us back to center, to start to say, this church actually looks more like Jesus than a big box business over here?
Yeah. In the book, the first third goes through a lot of what we just described of the history, basically how we got to this obsession with bigness. The middle goes through some of the dangers of that, but then it makes a turn at the end during the last section. And the first 2 chapters of the last section, where we make that turn toward the positive, I gave them a fairly, what's the word I'm looking for? Sometimes controversial titles, but I don't think they're controversial at all. I think they're just direct. So there are 2 of them. One of them is discipleship fixes everything. And the other one is integrity is the new competence. So let me walk you through them. First of all, discipleship fixes everything. The way I write a book is I have a general idea of where I want to go and the kind of things I want to talk about. So I'm writing this book and I'm putting all these things together, and I'm starting to collect all of these, ideas to answer the question you just asked. So what do we do now? How do we course correct? And I've got all this clump of stuff, and it's all just poured onto a document, right? It's just, there's no organization to it whatsoever. I've just got all these pieces, and it now comes time to arrange these into something that people can actually read. So I start looking through them. I go, so what threads do I have in common that would tie chapters together? And I start reading through it, and I read this one and I go, well, that's really about discipleship. And then I read the next one, I go, well, that's really about more discipleship. I read the next one, I go, well, that's really more discipleship. And at about 9 or 10 in a row, I go, man, it's like discipleship fixes everything. And I went, ding, 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 ding. Discipleship fixes. And then I asked, is that true? And I started going, and I think about it. Can you think of a problem a church has that discipleship won't fix? I have yet to come up with one. Lack of finances, discipleship will fix that. Lack of volunteers, bad theology, lack of evangelism. You can't name a significant problem that discipleship won't fix. The only thing discipleship will not promise to fix is the size of your church. For 2 reasons. One, because the size of your church isn't a problem to fix. It's part of a strategy that God is using. And secondly, because there will come times when you have to make a choice between, do I go deeper in discipleship and maybe lose some people? Or do I go for the numerical increase by going light on discipleship? Most of the time, they are hand in hand. Numerical increase and discipleship go hand in hand, probably 99% of the time. But there's going to be that 1% time when you got to make a choice, one or the other. And so you got to choose discipleship. So that's the first one, discipleship. We've got to reinvest in discipleship. It is the thing Jesus called us to do. He didn't call us to put more people in the seats. Nobody can read through the Bible honestly, get to the end of it and go, oh, we're supposed to get more people in a building. That's what Jesus was all about. It isn't in the text. Okay. But discipleship is everywhere. So discipleship is the new competence is one. And the second one is integrity.
Well, can I stop with discipleship? I want to just go a little bit deeper into discipleship. But one, I just want to point out, Jesus says he's the one that grows the church, right?
Yes.
Where he calls us to go and make disciples. But I was just reading somebody's post today, and it seemed like their call to discipleship was an amalgamation of American culture and some Jesus culture. Like it was a mix between. So how do we make sure that discipleship is disciple towards Jesus, to look like Jesus, to actually observe everything that Jesus commanded and he calls us to, and not an amalgamation of our own culture that we were raised in? Because I know that most of our worldview has subconscious assumptions. Like we don't actually realize the lens in which we're viewing things through. And so our discipleship is off. So what does that look like for us to make sure that our discipleship is also healthy?
Yeah, I fully agree in your assessment of that, by the way. And to me, the key guard, you'll never, ever guarantee that we won't go off, but the key guard against going off into the ditch theologically is that we need to disciple the way Jesus discipled, the way the Apostle Paul discipled, the way the early church discipled, which was through mentoring. In fact, I don't think you can truly call it discipleship if it's not built around a mentoring relationship. Jesus taught crowds. He did not disciple the crowds. Like the highest number we've got for disciples in the Gospels is 70, 72, and in the book of Acts 120. But above that, the Bible calls them crowds. The Bible, now they can all be discipled, but they're going to be discipled by various people. Okay, so you've got the Apostle Paul saying things like, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. That's what discipleship looks like. So in a lot of the American church, we have a curriculum bias that I think has tilted a little too far to one end. I'm for curriculum, I'm pro curriculum. I think good curriculum is important. But if we're going to be discipling people, rather than just having them finish the classes, then we need to build it around relationship. So if relationship is not at the core of your discipleship program, I'm going to say it's not discipleship. And because when you're in relationship, then it's about behavior and it's about character. And then back to Paul's statement, when he says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ, implied in that is, if Paul stops following Christ, then stop following Paul. Right? But if you're only teaching and people don't know it because you're only a person on a stage or a head on a screen and you don't know their character. And I mean, I'm not going to give you any names. I don't need to give you the names of just the last few months, right? Of people who we thought we knew, but it turns out nobody really did know because nobody could get close enough. And so they could hide a whole lot of things. Now, there are a whole lot of small church pastors that have just as many skeletons in their closets, but they're usually found out a little earlier than that because people can get close enough to them to discover that. And so mentoring also takes care of some of those hidden skeleton things as well. So if we're going to really truly disciple people, it has to be built around a mentoring relationship with a mature Christian of strong character.
I think that's fantastic. I think we do need some mentorship, apprenticeship, what that looks like, and some experiential learning, and not just curriculum. So that's fantastic. It's good. Let's move into integrity. Integrity is the new competency. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. For a good generation, a good 40 years now, we have taught methods, we have taught techniques, and we have assumed that the people we are teaching those techniques to are people of character because it's a room full of pastors. And as we already talked about, I don't believe we can make that assumption anymore. There's been too many places where it has been proven that there's a lot of people without character in that crowd and sometimes on the stage. So we cannot assume integrity anymore. And we have to understand that integrity is the basis for everything. You can build a crowd through technique, and you can lose it in a second through a lack of character. And we have to be people of character. We are not going to reverse the negative trends in the American church by better methods. Our methods are about as good as they're ever going to get. Our videos aren't going to get any better. Our sound quality isn't going to get any better. Our bands aren't going to sound any better. I mean, you look at the best of all those. Is there a little bit of tweaking we can do? Yeah. Should we try for more excellence? Yeah, absolutely. But we're close to the peak of how good we are going to get methodologically and technically. But we are close to the bottom that any of us have ever seen in integrity. And so I dare you, I don't think anybody listening knows of a single person who says they're deconstructing their faith or they're an ex-evangelical or they've left the church. You can't find anybody who's left the church because we didn't have our technical excellence up to par. Nobody's leaving the church going, oh, well, I wanted to follow Jesus, but that video was so cheesy. I mean, nobody is leaving because of cheesy videos. But you'll find a lot of people who will say, yeah, I wanted to follow Jesus, but the people who say they're following Jesus aren't people that I can trust. Now that you'll find, we're not losing people because of our lack of technical excellence. We're losing people because of our lack of integrity. And integrity needs to make a huge comeback in the church.
It's good. So then what do we do with celebrity? I mean, especially Americans are obsessed with celebrity, and we're then obsessed with celebrity pastors and people that we platform and we put up on stage and, want to learn from them.
Celebrity, as you know, I take an entire chapter to deal with it. The title of the chapter is Inevitable: Why the Christian Celebrity Culture Guarantees Moral Failure. And I know this is a strong statement, but I stand by it. No, I'm not saying that everybody who has become famous as a Christian is a moral failure. That's not what I'm saying. But the Christian celebrity culture guarantees moral failure. And here's why. When you create higher stages with bigger microphones under brighter lights, you attract people who want to be on higher platforms under brighter lights with bigger microphones. You attract narcissists. you're creating this narcissism magnet when you build the stages bigger. And in fact, one of the real healthy things that's happening in the church right now is, while the big stage and the bright lights and the big microphone was really appealing to my generation. I'm a boomer. I'm a late boomer, but I'm a boomer. Boomers loved that because that to us was a sign of authority. And that was to us a sign of success. Newer generations look at the big stage and especially the higher physical stages and the bright lights and the big microphone and the radio voice from the preacher, and they see all of that with great suspicion, and they should. So what we saw as a sign of authority, they see through the lens of distrust. They want somebody who's going to sit in a circle with them, ask and answer honest questions, be willing to be challenged in what they say they believe, to be honest, to be real, to be vulnerable. That was a sign of weakness, and for a lot of people in my generation today is still considered a sign of weakness. Vulnerability is not a sign of weakness. Vulnerability to today's generation is seen as a sign of trustworthiness. We've got to make that shift. So celebrity, there will always be a pull towards celebrity, and people of all ages are willing victims into the trap of celebrity. So it's not an age thing to love celebrity and to praise people on big stages. But I think there's a bit of a trend towards a healthier thing. And I think the church should have always been about that. We should have always rejected the idea that somehow somebody else other than Jesus is getting the attention.
Yeah, I think we need to be very wary of it. And we have to get back into like pastoral ministry, what that looks like. Part of it, I mean, you do mention, Ephesians 4 there, the equipping of the saints for the works of ministry. Pastor is mentioned there, and that's it.
It's the only place. Yep.
It's the only place. And so all five. So part of it is what I'm thinking is, when you're thinking about growth and scale and getting bigger, you're actually looking at some apostolic type of ministry, right? That you're trying to establish something new and to get something there. There is a difference between, a shepherd and an apostolic ministry or an evangelistic ministry. How do we work together, and what does leadership structure could look like in a healthy church where it doesn't revolve around one celebrity pastor, but there are some teams and people that are equipping the saints for the works of service?
Yeah, the framing of that question is something I never thought about, and that's a very great, a really good way to put it. I think we are obviously those with an apostolic or an evangelism gift, and depending on the theology of the listener, you interpret those two things the way your theology interprets them. But they do tend to be the vanguard. They tend to be the point of the spear. They tend to be first in. And I think for the 40 years now, I think we've allowed those to be seen not just as first in, but kind of as the example that we should follow at all times. But after the gospel has been pronounced to others, for those who have an apostolic gift to go somewhere where the gospel has never been, after people have come to Christ because the evangelist gift kicks in and people are sharing the good news with them, we then need to have teachers and pastors, and the prophetic gift is part of that, the tip of the spear as well. Or sometimes the prophetic gift is simply speaking the truth, often to a wayward church. So the prophet is often a corrective there. But all of those need to be in balance. And I think it is, I think they've done studies, and because it's a question off the top of my head, I don't have it right here with me, but I know there are studies that have shown that the fastest growing churches over the last 40 years have been predominantly started and led for a long time by people who feature evangelistic and apostolic gifts. And then what you have is at the end of that time, when you have the transition to the next generation, that tends to be when people with the teaching gifts step in and people with the pastoring gifts step in. And that's sometimes seen as a negative, but I don't think it needs to be, because I think while they should have been surrounding them all that time to build the depth into it, there's no problem with the fact that now we're being led by a pastor rather than by an apostle, and we're going to go deep into teaching into ministry rather than simply trying to get our numbers up all the time. There are different seasons where different parts of them need to take a lead. And we have seen the second, third generation collapse where it moves from mission into bureaucracy. But moving from evangelist into teacher is not the same as moving from mission into bureaucracy. And sometimes we have equated the two. Now, the thing is, they should all five be in order. If you've got a church that's starting with someone who's got an evangelistic and prophetic gift, but you surround them with people who have strong shepherding gifts, strong pastoring gifts, strong teaching gifts, strong prophetic gifts to make course corrections when the evangelist is going off, into an area because of their excitability, then the transition to a pastor-led model later will be healthier and stronger and more vibrant because of that. We in the church that I've been serving now for 31 years, we did that 6 years ago. I pastored this church for 25 years, and I had one set of gifts. And now the pastor has taken over after me, who was my youth pastor for the entire 25 years, by the way, has a totally different set of gifts. And so it was led by my gifts for 25 years with his gifts in support. Now it's being led by his gifts with my gifts in support. And it's better and stronger today than it was 6 years ago when I handed it off, because this is the time for his gifts to take the lead and for my gifts to be in support. And those will change. And we shouldn't be afraid of those things changing. And they should all five be in play. They'll never all five be in equal balance. But as long as over the long term of, and we're talking long term of multiple generations, as long as over that long term, all of them are strongly represented in different eras, I think we can have long-term generational strength. But part of the challenge of the church growth movement and of those who I think have misunderstood it is, we talked about it earlier, it's not that you just get fast, you got to get fat. You got to get, not just that you got big, but you have to get big fast. And we're not playing a long-term strategy. We're not thinking, and the kingdom, God's timing is always different than ours. We want it done fast and now. And God's going, hang on, 1,000 years is a day, and a day is 1,000 years. I'm on a totally different clock than you. And his clock is usually way slower than ours.
Yeah. Frustrating at times.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's way slower.
Yeah.
But it's good. It is healthy for us to walk in that. Talk about like your people in Pasadena, if your church. How does health work in community with churches? And can we start to work together to help our community, and that we're not in competition with the church on the other side of our community, but we can actually start to work together because we are one body of Christ. What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Pasadena is near me, but I'm not in Pasadena. The town I'm in is Fountain Valley near Huntington Beach. Not that matters to anybody. But yeah, this is one of the reasons for the pastoral transition was I am not as good at what you just asked about as my current pastor is. So I came to this church 31 years ago. There was a kid basically helping out and overseeing the youth group of this tiny little church. And he was the youth pastor by default. And for the next 25 years, he was my youth pastor. And he is amazing at connecting. For years, it was with other youth pastors, and now it's with other pastors in the region. And he just does simple things like whenever he hears that there's a new youth pastor in the area, he makes sure he calls them up and says, hey, let me take you out for coffee. How can we help you? Now he does the same with local pastors in the region. He hears there's a new pastor in the area. He calls them up and says, let me take you out for coffee. How can we help you? He's way better at that. He's much more of an extrovert. I'm an introvert. I see the value of that, but it just doesn't occur to me to do it. Right? But he's amazing at that. And so if you're the introvert like me, sometimes you just got to get out of your comfort zone and do it. But maybe the main thing is pray the Lord of the harvest, not only that he will send laborers into the harvest field, but also that maybe he'll raise up one of the people, one of the pastors in your area who is a little more extroverted, to whom it does occur naturally. You can support them in helping to connect the congregations within your neighborhood. And when we do that, all ships rise. We have a really good association with a whole lot of churches in our neighborhood. Not the majority of them. I live in such a populated neighborhood with so many different people. It's different than in a small town where every pastor of every church can know each other. But we know each other fairly well here, and it's mostly because of my current pastor who's been able to reach out over the years. And now, as I do things like this, and as I travel around, I now have made far more connections outside of my area with pastors around the country and around the world. But as we discover new ideas, and as we see people in need, and as we see the church needing help, we should reach out. Somebody who's doing this extraordinarily well is Dan Nichols in New York State with Northeast Collaborative. And he's in a mid-sized town, Cortland, New York, a town that even the people in town would say has seen better days. Cortland is in distress right now. He's doing amazing ministry there. And this Christmas, they are going to take their big Christmas offering, and it's their biggest offering of the year every time because they make a big deal out of it. And every penny in their big annual Christmas offering is going to go to 9 churches in their town and in the immediately surrounding towns, like the people who businesses would consider their competition. Because what he did was he reached out to all these churches and he said, I want you to write up and send me a method for outreach and evangelism that you want to follow, that you might need some money for. What do you want to do in your community that you might have a financial need for? And the 9 churches that sent in a game plan, they get to split the proceeds 9 ways. And he's just giving them the biggest offering of the year, and he's working with them. And in addition to that, he's like, do you need our people? Do you need our supplies? Do you need our equipment? Can we clear our schedule so that we'll be there with you for that Saturday event you're doing or whatever? And it takes typically one person that is going to do that. So if you're the extrovert, if you're the one that might be feeling called to do that, step up and go, how can I just simply call the pastors and say, hey, I want to sit down. How can we help you? What can we do? If you're a pastor of a larger church that's got the resources, ask around how your resources can be used to help others. If you're the introvert that likes the idea, but you can't see yourself making those calls and being the person, ask, Lord, is there somebody here that might be the one to do so that I can get behind?
Yeah, that's great. If you could talk to your readers, what would you hope that they would take from this book, Desizing the Church, and what would you want them to implement going forward?
Yeah, I think the 2 keys are those 2 chapters we talked about already. Let's refocus from size to integrity and discipleship. Let's decide that for 40 years, we have pursued numerical increase as though it was the inevitable byproduct of health. I now call this the myth of inevitability. Sometimes numerical increase and occasionally extreme numerical increase is the result of health and integrity. But most of the time, if church stats can be believed, 90% of churches are small, which means the vast majority of the time, churches have integrity and are healthy, but don't see the massive numerical increase. So we've got to get our eyes off of numbers as not just the main, but sometimes the exclusive way that we judge the value of a church. And we've got to start asking, are we discipling our people and are we acting with integrity? We've got to make that shift, and we've got to say it and practice it over and over and over again. And quite frankly, we've got to hold each other accountable to it. And we can't hold each other accountable to it on X, formerly Twitter. Now, I don't have a problem with people who are doing that kind of work there, but that's not where you're going to get the greatest value. The greatest value is going to come from what you just talked about. Pastors who have relationships with people in their church and who have relationships with each other and know each other well enough that they can encourage each other when they're down and they can call each other on their garbage when they stray. That's where the impact is going to be had.
Amen. That's so good. 2 really quick questions at the end here. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Relax, love Jesus, and let him build his church. I've got this comical conversation that plays in the back of my head every once in a while. I imagine, it's not in the Bible, I'll say this up front, but I imagine that there might have been a conversation between Jesus and his disciples where Jesus went, okay, guys, you got it clear. I'm going to build my church. You guys go make disciples. And they go, got it. We're going to build your church. And he goes, no. I'll build the church. You make disciples. Oh, okay. I got it. I understand. We'll go to build the church. If I were to talk to my 1-year-old self, I would say, make disciples, stay a person of character, and let Jesus take care of the numbers.
That's so good. That's great. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Yeah. The book of the year, aside from Decising the Church, actually, I named it as my book of the year for last year, and the all books I read last year was The Great De-Churching. The Great De-Churching, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author. It's got 3 authors. One of them is Ryan Burge, but can't remember the other 2. The Great De-Churching, an extraordinary book. It talks about the place that we are right now, particularly in the American church, with a larger number of people leaving the church now than joined the church at any other time in American history. It's the biggest demographic shift religiously in American history, and it's toward the negative. They talk about what the actual numbers are, where it's actually coming from, where the silver lining might be, and what are some course corrections that we can take. So to me, that is, I keep coming back to the stuff in that book. It's so important and so helpful. And for all of what sounds like a statistical list that I just mentioned, it really is an easy read and very understandable. They don't just give you a bunch of graphs and numbers. They really walk you through the principles really well. So The Great De-Churching, I highly, highly recommend.
Great recommendation. Karl, where could people go out and get the Desizing the Church, and where would you like to point people to? How can they connect with you?
Yeah, you can buy Desizing the Church anywhere you buy books. It's everywhere. It's with Moody Press, so it's a major publisher and it's everywhere. And anything you want to follow up with me, KarlVaters.com, as long as you can spell my name right. Karl with a K, Vaters with a V and a T in the middle, and don't forget the S at the end. There's all kinds of different ways you can spell my name wrong. But KarlVaters.com is my website. I put out an article a week. I put out a podcast every couple of weeks. I've got guest writers that appear on a regular basis there as well.
Amazing. Well, Karl, thank you for this. Thank you for taking us through the church growth movement, where we have gotten to this place of numbers are king and key, and what are some course corrections that we could make so that we could be healthy, that we could put discipleship where it actually matters, because it can solve everything, and then make sure that we have integrity as we're walking through and leading churches and seeing some good church health. So thank you for this conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. And I'm excited for people to get a lot of stuff out of this conversation, because it was well done. Way to go.
Thanks. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.